wonderful flowing, and just people have been wonderful. So we are here to discuss a really important issue, and that is discussing the issues of policy in relation to health impacts of climate change. So if you're not intending, or you were not planning on attending this session, you might be in the wrong room and need to be next door. But let me tell you, the fun is here. So you chose wisely. So I think we all, just by sheer experience, have been dealing with the challenges of climate change. We see more wildfires, we see more droughts, we see more floods, we see more crop failures, we see more heat waves, and you can't get away from it because every time you turn on the TV channels to listen to the news, it's yet one more impact of climate change. And so as we look at all of those impacts of climate change, health and the impacts on health feature strongly in all of them. Now, WHO has already stated that climate change presents a fundamental threat to human health. And we've seen the way in which its effects are being felt worldwide. Well, the Inter-Academy panel has seen it fit to take on this challenge. And together with multiple partners, remember the IAP comprises about 150 academies of science, engineering, and medicine from throughout the world, they produced 2 reports in 2022. And these reports highlighted the impacts of climate change on health. But along comes Save the Children. And they decide they want to have case reports. And so what IAP has done together with Save the Children is to commission a whole range of practical and real examples of the impact of climate change. And so the report, which I will just point to you, this report comprises several case studies from multiple different countries highlighting various challenges that we are grappling with in relation to climate change. And this report is available at the back at the end of the session. Please don't rush right now to get it. So in looking at climate change and its impact on health, we are very fortunate to have in our midst some of the world's leading experts. And I will invite each of them to comment, and I will give them 10 minutes each to provide their comments. I warn them I'm a strict timekeeper, and so at the end of the 40 minutes of presentation, I will then invite all of you to ask the panel questions or to raise any queries or challenge them with some of the big issues we're grappling with in climate change and health. I've been amiss in not introducing myself, so let me do that before I introduce our first speaker. So my name is Salim Abdul Karim. I run an AIDS research center at the Nelson Mandela Medical School in Durban, South Africa. I am Pro-Vice Chancellor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. And I'm also Professor of Global Health at Columbia University, Professor of Clinical Medicine at Cornell University, and Professor of Immunology and Infectious Diseases at Harvard University. But we are very fortunate today to have with us our first speaker, Montira Pongseri. She comes to us from Save the Children. Now, She started off initially as an environmental health scientist with the EPA. She then went on to becoming the first science advisor at the US mission to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the ASEAN, and currently she's senior advisor on climate and health at Save the Children. We're indeed very fortunate to have in our midst Montira Pongseri. The floor is yours.
So what I'm going to do is present a collaboration on case studies with the Inter-Academy Partnership. Peter McGrath is sitting right here, so please, thanks to Peter as well. So I'm going to introduce first IEP, then Save the Children, and then describe some of the premise for our work together on climate change and health through the case studies collection that you see in the back. IEP, as you know, is the global network of national academies of science, medicine, and engineering. It is composed of 150 member academies spanning 4 regions. Spanning 4 regions, Africa, Europe, the Americas, and Asia. And it consists, or its makeup is more than 30,000 leading scientists, engineers, and health professionals in more than 100 countries. Save the Children is an international NGO working in humanitarian and development settings with communities, governments, civil society, and private sector funders. For Save the Children, climate change and health, particularly the health impacts of climate change, is critical because climate adaptation and planning and climate mitigation planning by countries cannot ignore health. Doing so would result in unintended consequences and ultimately undermine our well-intentioned efforts to improve health. So we work with partners, with communities, with governments and decision makers to co-design climate adaptation actions to better prepare for, to reduce, and to manage the health risks of climate change. Research and learning is very important to how we design our programming and how we work with strategic partners like the IAP. So human activities impact our biophysical systems and socioeconomic trends in interconnected ways. Just since 1950, our global population has tripled. Our real global GDP has increased by 7 times. Freshwater use by more than 3 times, and energy use by 5 times. So these changes have been described by Stefan et al. As the most rapid transformation of the human relationship with the natural world in the history of humankind. These changes affect now Earth's underpinning systems. Rising levels of greenhouse gases and a warming planet, ocean acidification, and losses of our fisheries, our forests, and our biodiversity. So these unprecedented human-driven changes threaten our health, our well-being, and they threaten our sustainable development. So under current Paris Agreement country commitments, a child born in 2020 will experience on average across their lifetime twice more wildfires, 2.6 times more drought, 2.8 times more floods.
I'm just going to move this back.
Thank you. Yes, exactly. Thank you very much, Salim. Thank you. So a child born in 2020 will experience over their lifetimes on average 2 times more wildfires, 2.6 times more droughts, 2.8 times more floods, 2.8 times more crop failures, and 6.8 times more heat waves compared to a child born in 1960. So we know the data show that children in low and middle income countries will continue to experience the worst impacts of climate change. And those impacts will be greater for some children, those living through conflict, those experiencing discrimination and inequality on the basis of gender, displacement, and other factors. So climate change is among the greatest public health threats to child survival. And this is because climate change disrupts and damages the functions of our natural systems, such as our oceans, our lands, and forests, which in turn affect the provision of our food, safe drinking water, and our clean air. So these are some of the most concerning health impacts of climate change that happen through many different pathways: complex, direct, indirect pathways, heat-related illnesses and deaths, increasing risk of asthma and pneumonia through air pollution exposure, malnutrition from global mean temperature rise leading to lower crop yields, especially in drought-affected areas. And then there's the increased risk of dengue, Zika, and other diseases from changing rainfall patterns, which increase the potential for breeding sites of their mosquito vectors. And the latest IPCC synthesis report noted mental health challenges associated with higher temperatures, trauma from extreme events. There is variation in these most concerning health impacts of climate change within and across countries and regions. And these vary by gender, by age, income, and the ability to cope with the challenge. So climate change increases inequities in the present and for future generations. For Save the Children, climate change and health is a climate health and equity challenge altogether. In 2022, we developed an organization-wide strategy that all 100 country offices address. And that programming takes a systems-based, multi-sectoral approach to addressing climate health and equity together. And this is how we're operationalizing it, trying to improve understanding of the impacts and interconnections between human activities, climate change, health, and the social determinants that contribute to it. We're increasing awareness of the health co-benefits of taking action to address climate change by fostering communities to identify and test interventions. We're breaking through those decision-making silos, those stubborn silos, by facilitating multi-sectoral governance through the use of decision support tools, through integrated data, and those integrated data that support decision-making. For example, for improved monitoring and tracking of health impacts across changing environmental conditions, but also being able to develop vulnerability assessments and even to quantify the health benefits of taking action on climate change, but also quantifying the health costs of not taking any action. And in doing this, we have to increase our participation with communities who are most affected. And we're doing this by increasing their capacity, leadership, and skills to engage with us on the co-design and co-implementation of interventions. And last, we're using advocacy to interact with the public and private sectors to increase finance for climate and health. This is one example of an activity that's currently underway with the government of Laos, with the WHO Laos Country Office, and with the Green Climate Fund to increase the climate resilience of the health system. This is the first health-focused Green Climate Fund awarded project. Our objective is to increase the resilience of these health sectors, of the health sector in 7 climate vulnerable provinces in Laos. And we're doing this through 4 interconnected activities that are meant to inform one another over the next 5 years. First is to strengthen the health system, their governance and leadership to be more climate resilient by updating their strategies, policies, action plans, based on what we know about the relationship between climate change and health in the Lao country context. Second, we're upgrading health information systems to include weather variables related to dengue and diarrheal diseases. Third, health service delivery in rural provinces will be improved and able to manage the burden of dengue and diarrheal disease. Then fourth, but importantly, communities need to be engaged, to be informed and motivated to respond to early warnings that come from these improved health information systems. So let me come back to the collaboration now that I've laid out some of the rationale for working on climate change, health, and equity together. So in 2019, the IAP started a regional to global project on climate change and health. It culminated in a global report on health in the climate emergency. And it noted the importance of taking a systems-based approach with cross-sectoral integration to producing science for policy use. Save the Children's programming strategy, as I mentioned, also noted the need to take a systems-based multi-sectoral approach. In 2023, we agreed to work together. We put out a global call for case studies, which take a systems-based approach with a policy intent. In the fall of 2023, IAP hosted a peer review workshop with selected case study authors who presented their work in front of a peer review committee of experts. We shared feedback. Based on that feedback, we edited the case studies and then published it. And that's what you see behind you. So please take your book back with you. Ahead of last year's COP28, in Dubai, we produced a science policy brief based on preliminary findings of those case studies, of lessons learned. So here's an infographic that accompanies the case study book that you will take with you. And the infographic really summarizes some of those lessons learned that we thought were important for doing science differently for policy impact and policy use. Among those lessons learned are to work early on with user communities to inform your research questions, to early on work to produce and have a plan to produce evidence with policymakers and the affected communities. Another lesson is to prioritize equity, to identify which groups are most affected and understand why they're most affected. I'm going to pause there and thank you very much for your attention and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Montiel. Well, you really set the stage and articulated very clearly the collaboration between your two organizations. And you've laid a good foundation for Claudia Holzeis, who is our next speaker. So Claudia, when she completed her doctoral research on plant science at Oxford, went on to join several development projects in Asia, Africa, Latin America, focusing principally on plant genetics. But she's currently chief executive of the Kirkhouse Trust, and she's been one of the central individuals involved in the IAP's Climate Change and Health Project. Over to you, Claudia.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers of this event for the opportunity to be here. So I will be presenting one of the case studies included in the book just mentioned by Montira. It's on the Kirkhouse Trust, which is an organization, not-for-profit organization registered in the UK. But I want to first provide some of the context of the work. And as we know, what we eat has a very big impact on our health. So adequate nutrition is key for a healthy, productive lifestyle. And what this graph shows is that early progress in reducing the number of people who face hunger and the prevalence of undernourishment has been reversed in recent years. And in 2023, over 700 million people did not have enough to eat, and close to 3 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet. So climate change has got a very big impact on food systems as a whole, but in particularly on food production in areas in the world that rely on precipitation as a source of water. And this pertains to 95% of the food production in African countries. The photos shown here are of 3 research fields for projects funded by the Kirkhouse Trust in Ethiopia, in Mozambique, and in Zambia. And what we're seeing more and more frequently is that extreme weather events completely destroy the harvest. Well, in this case, experiments, but the food production in the neighboring fields. And so farming is an increasingly risky activity. Now, food productions are also part of the problem because they account for about 1/3 of the anthropogenic greenhouse emissions. So it's very important to make agriculture more sustainable and food systems sustainable and also healthier. We just heard that one of the key messages of the 2 publications by IAP and Save the Children is that you need a systems-based approach to make any difference in climate change action. But what this case study was trying to address is the question, if you're a small organization with limited funds, you just don't have the capacity for a system-based approach. You have neither the resources nor the required expertise. So the question is, how can you maximize the impact of limited resources? I'll introduce the Kirkhouse Trust, KT. So it was established in the year 2000 by Ed Sutton, and some of you may know Ed Sutton because he's the inventor of the Sutton blot. It's a molecular biology technique that is used very extensively. He also invented the DNA microarray, and it's the commercialization, also the revenue of this invention that funds KT, so we don't need to do any fundraising. He wanted to promote the use of molecular biology for human good, and we now operate as a charity in perpetuity. So Ed chose, and I just want to say, I also want to recognize Sonia Morgan, who's a co-founder of the organization of KT. So we have three main objectives. It is to improve important legume crops in African countries and in India. Legumes were chosen because they're very nutritious. It's a very diverse group of plants. Some of them are very drought and heat tolerant. The grain is used for home consumption, it's used as a market commodity, and the leftover store is used for animal feed. And the cultivation of legumes improves soil health because of the ability of legumes to establish symbiotic relationships with soil bacteria that fix nitrogen. So the first group of projects, they are crop breeding activities focused on common bean, on cowpea, on bambara groundnut. And the breeding targets are pest and disease resistance, increased tolerance to heat and drought, higher nutrition content, and also lower cooking time, which is very important to both us because energy and water are limiting in many of the countries. The second group of projects aims to establish the resilience of a number of legumes that are underutilized. This is a stress-tolerant orphan legume program. And there are two reasons. One is that the cultivation of the common crops is beginning to fail in many of the areas because of heat and drought stress. But the second one is you want to manage risk in crop production systems, so you need to diversify them. And then the third overarching aim is to increase scientific capacity in the target countries, and this is focused on public sector institutions. So there are four key elements to the funding focus. One is scientific mentoring. We're not just an organization that gives a grant. We work in collaboration with the grantees, and training is provided in the form of visits to US host labs, during training programs in our yearly meetings, and also workshops in African countries. Then the philosophy is that all the grantees have to be able to do the work in their own research institutions. So we set up the labs and screen houses, and we maintain these infrastructures operational. So one of my colleagues is in charge of sending periodic supplies of consumables to the countries funded. It's very important to engage the intended beneficiaries of the research, and in the case of the projects funded by KT, these are smallholder farmers. And they're important just to establish what the projects should be, so what are the varieties to be improved and for what, and what are the key traits or characteristics to keep. Very often the color of the grain is very important, taste. But also their input is essential in the later stages of the breeding program in the selection of the advanced breeding lines that are being considered for release. And then the fourth element is long-term support. A breeding program takes years to come to fruition. So in this photo, we have Esther Arunga and Sobdagone. KT started supporting them when they were master students. And now they each had their own research groups in Kenya and Cameroon, respectively. So I think it's been a very long time, a very long-term collaboration. This infographic is of a recent review paper of the achievements of the KT-funded projects in the last 20 years. There have been 30 improved legume varieties released, 20 for cowpea, 4 for common bean, and 6 for dolichos. There have been over 260 peer-reviewed papers published. There have been 31 laboratories established and maintained, close to 2,500 orphan legume stress-tolerant orphan legume accessions have been tested, and we have awarded now 50 PhD scholarships, and I think probably 62 master scholarships to date. There were also programs that were specifically targeting training for university students. One is still operational in Zimbabwe. And the photo here shows the mobile lab, which finished because the vehicle essentially ended its functional life. And this was an ex-military vehicle that was recommissioned as a laboratory. And it traveled in Ghana from between higher education institutions to train students. So what are the key lessons for us? For small-scale organizations, we believe you need to have a very narrow focus if you want to make a difference. However, you do need partnerships because you have to be able to address a complex problem that requires multi-sectorial input. In terms of the scientific capacity, it's important to establish and maintain communities that share problems, so they can also share the solution and the research products developed. And this amplifies the impact of interventions, because in one area, many countries will be facing very similar challenges. Long-term support is critical, so projects that just start and end in 3 years will not achieve anything. And for us, it's very important because this also comes with the provision of infrastructure. Then risk communication and management is critical. Also, so of course for farming systems, but also for research, because if you don't plan carefully, you could lose everything in one season of extreme weather events. And then my final point is enabling an integrated national and regional policies are key, especially for small organizations, because they provide the structure or the framework that enables smaller interventions to contribute to national development plans, including climate change action and better health. And my last slide is just to acknowledge the people who do the work. Not all of them. This is the current cohort of principal investigators funded by KT and not the students. And in the last row to the right, the scientific advisors who mentor and guide the projects. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much, Claudia. That was really giving us a very good tour de force of the Kirkhouse Trust. I didn't realize it was created by Ed Sutton. I did my PhD doing Southern Blots many years ago, so it's wonderful to hear that. Well, our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Anthony Clayton. Anthony is Professor of Caribbean Sustainable Development at the University of West Indies. He's a Fellow of TWAS, a member of the Jamaican government's Climate Change Advisory Board, and a member of its Rule of Law Committee, which I found very interesting. With over 30 years' experience in policy development, focusing among many things on climate change, I can't think of anyone better to speak to us at this time than Professor Clayton. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to be facing a number of challenges over the next few years, and we're not going to be able to address all of them individually because there are a number of deep interconnections between these different problems. And I'm just going to look at 4 in particular. One is demography. By the end of the century, we will have several billion more people than we do now. That's quite a lot of extra mouths to feed and people to house. But we will then, in fact, before we get there, we will be transitioning into a very different phase as much the world will be aging out by that point. And the problems as the population ages out and actually shrinks are probably going to be more challenging than this period of growth. Because the median age on planet Earth now is around about 29, but by the time we get to 2050, the median age will be 41, and I'll say a little bit about what that means for the structure of the population in just a minute. On top of that, we're going to be dealing with climate change. Now, we're going past the 1.5% centigrade rise, the thing we thought was the threshold. We're going past that roundabout now. We're probably going to get at least 2.5 degrees. There's some scenarios we're going to get significantly more. What this means is that we are now probably looking at a future with large-scale forced migration from parts of the world where the temperature will be too hot to support human existence in its current form. And on top of that, as a combination of the demographic growth and internal migration and relocation away from flooded areas, we're going to add about close to 4 billion more people to urban populations. And this means, just done the math for you, we'd need to build about another 200 cities, megacities, with over 20 million inhabitants in each, in principle, to provide the housing for the people who will have to be moving over that same period. Now, in very broad generic terms, we know, or we think we know, the sorts of things that we should be doing. We have to greatly, substantially increase the efficiency with which we produce food, provide energy, water, manage our waste, and so forth. We're going to have to think very hard about how we adjust to a much more elderly society, transition to low-carbon energy supplies, and find some quite radically new solutions for the problems of urban living, because cities at the moment consume most of our energy resources and generate most of our waste, apart from, of course, also generating about 3/4 of world GDP. So we're going to have to think how our cities operate. All of this, any one of these would be challenging, but we're going to have to be addressing all of these issues at the same time. And of course, this is where we need a fairly integrated approach to managing, coming up with multiple solutions to multiple problems. Now I'm going to focus on the health issue to break out some of the challenges and complexities that we're going to have to address. And to do this, I need to give you a little background. Back at the time of the Roman Empire, going back about 2,000 years, just to give you, this is deep background, world average life expectancy was probably in the range 20 to 25 due to problems with infectious disease, in particular very high rates of infant mortality. Now, it took close to 2,000 years for world average life expectancy to rise from 25 to 30. And that's a rate of gain of about 1 extra day of life per year. Very slow rate of gain. Now, everything changed round about year 1900, because between 1900 and year 2000, life expectancy, global average life expectancy doubled. Now, that's a rate of gain of over 100 days of life per year, which meant that the rate of gain approximately doubled round about that time. Doctors can't take too much of the credit for this, I'm afraid, because most of that resulted from basic improvements in water and sanitation, agriculture, food storage, and increases in economic productivity, which enabled us to support a much larger population, and of course progress with things like immunization, which enabled us to finally start to contend with the problem of infectious disease. The greatest impact, again, obviously being in terms of reduced infant mortality. Now, this is where it's going to get more challenging, because the profile of health impacts is going to change. As you can see, there's still some variance in terms of population growth projections, partly because the single most important predictor of growth is a woman's control over her fertility. And as that has changed over the last several decades, what we've seen is family sizes coming down in almost every part of the world. But if you look at the bottom here now, this is where we are now going to be looking at the effects of the surge in population growth that we have lived through, which is the inevitable consequence that this population will now be aging out. About a third of the population of Europe and China, by the time we get to 2050, will be aged over 60. A quarter of the population of the United States will be over the age of 65, as compared to 14% today. And globally, we'll have about 3 billion people over the age of 60. And what in turn that means is an inevitable rise in non-communicable and degenerative disease. At the moment, NCDs cause about 3/4 of all deaths globally. That's projected to rise to about 86% of all deaths by 2050. And most of those, about 80%, result from 4 groups of diseases: cardiovascular, cancer, respiratory disease, and diabetes. Now, the problem here is that NCD treatment is long-term and therefore relatively high cost. And that's the real challenge, that we have to find ways to make NCD treatment much more widely available and much more affordable. You look at the burden on our healthcare systems. Average healthcare spending in rich countries, for most of them it's about 9% of GDP now goes into healthcare, and that is inexorably driven up by the aging profile of the populations. It's about double that in the United States, primarily because of the healthcare model that the US has chosen, which is basically profit-oriented, and therefore that's requires a lot of administrative cost and profit taking off and so on. But over 80% of all NCD deaths now are in low and middle income countries. And so that represents a much more significant challenge, because these countries, many of them do not currently have the resources to meet the increased burden of disease, although of course that will change as these countries develop. There's various possible intervention options, some of which we can't do very much about. We can't do very much about the population aging out. Behavioral risk factors, however, we can do something about. And this is where we're looking at things like diet, physical inactivity, consumption of tobacco and alcohol and other things that are bad for you. And this is where, in fact, intervention is probably the single most cost-effective thing that we can do to get people to change their ways and give them more years of reasonably healthy life. Metabolic risk factors, some of this will depend on progress with medical treatments. Some of them, however, are also exacerbated or driven by poor lifestyle choices, so we can do something about some of these. But we also have to think about not just the socioeconomic cost of supporting the changing disease profile, we also have to think of the cost of that this is actually going to impose on our healthcare systems and our economies, because premature morbidity not only takes somebody out of the workforce earlier than they need have done, there are also issues with their dependents who they would have gone on supporting. The one thing that might be working for us in this case is that increased urbanization, which I mentioned earlier, actually does help to reduce the per unit cost of healthcare delivery, but that's going to be a relatively modest mitigating factor, I suspect. So a lot of the emphasis is going to have to shift to prevention. And there have been some quite encouraging examples. The UK, for example, banned smoking in public places in 2007, and they got a 20% decline in cardiovascular diseases in the first 10 years, with the result that that is now described as one of the UK's greatest health achievements of this century. Famous case in Finland when they mandated the salt reduction in processed food, and over the course of about 30-40 years, they got sodium intake down by about 40%, and a significant reduction in blood pressure levels, and an 80% drop in the death total due to stroke as a result. Now, this was significant because it's incredibly difficult to get people to change their diet. But as countries develop, a lot of the food moves from being relatively unprocessed to being highly processed. And what you can actually do, and this is a strange positive, but you can re-engineer the food ingredients to take out some of the more harmful elements. And technology, of course, although some of these solutions are not currently available, but they will be, include things like genome editing and AI robotics. Now, this is just the last slide. It may be that in future we will be able to take some cells from your body, we'll be able to regrow a replacement organ and transplant it back into you. This is not immediately available, but it will probably become so. But again, you have to think in terms of not just what we can do, but the cost, but how we can make it available. And the issue, again, always is going to be the cost factor involved in delivering this treatment to most of the planet. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Clayton. Well, we bring up the rear, and we've left some of the best for last with Dr. Shuru Dasgupta. He originally hails from Bangladesh, but his PhD in the science and management of climate change, and since joined the European Institute for Economics and the Environment, and so where he is currently a researcher. His research is on the impact of climate change on a whole range of issues like labor, food, security, health, and importantly, inequality. Over to you, Dr. Dasgupta.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and I'll try my best not to go too long. So, although I'm an economist, because my title is scientist, I often get invited to wrong forums, and it almost seems like this is it. I'm an academic. I see my job as generating robust evidence to aid policymaking. And today, let's look at the labor force. The labor force is likely the most affected domain in the context of heat stress and, by extension, climate change. Yeah? We are already seeing evidence that heat stress and climate change in general is having adverse effects or negative impacts on labor supply, the number of hours you work, labor productivity, your effort during these hours. Importantly, bringing in equality, these impacts are heterogeneous across space and sectors. Our latest research shows that climate change is having the highest effects in the most low-income regions, such as Asia and Africa. We're going to see some examples. And of course, in the relatively low-income sectors, such as agriculture and construction. In the long term, what we are seeing is that heat stress is essentially forcing workers to move away from high-exposure sectors such as agriculture and construction. There is some positive employment in indoor sectors or low-exposure sectors such as manufacturing and utilities, but not enough. So essentially what we are seeing, something Anthony already mentioned, is that the labor force is going to shrink in the long term unless substantial adaptation efforts are undertaken. Moving on, why do we care about climate change and the labor force, right? Well, as we have seen, increasing negative impact, but 2.4 billion out of the total workforce of 3.4 billion workers face heat stress or negative impacts or health impacts of heat stress at work. Yeah? Of course, those of us who are lucky enough to sit inside in air-conditioned venues, we don't really face the impacts. ILO estimates that there are nearly 23 million occupational injuries due to heat stress every year, and about 18,000 or 19,000 deaths. What I'm trying to get to is climate change is already affecting the human right to safe and healthy working conditions. So we put together this map. This paper actually came out earlier today. You can take a look at this at Nature Reviews, Earth and Environment. These are only recorded deaths due to heat stress. Annually, about 10,000 workers die in Gulf countries due to climate change. Many more die, actually, all across the world. We just don't know because occupational mortality or occupational deaths due to heat stress is actually not recorded in most countries. That remains a tragedy. As I said, as an academic, my job is to combine high-resolution climatic data with labor force surveys. This is just an example. We use data from about 10,000 subnational regions across the world to estimate what we call response functions. Temperature labor force response functions remain one of the weakest point in the literature looking into labor force. This is our attempt to change them. This is from our paper in the Lancet Planetary Health, but not as interesting. What we have recently been doing, and this is critical for the debate on loss and damage, is we have been trying actively to attribute changes in the labor force outcomes to historical climate change. what we find is a clear and measurable impact of historical climate change on the labor force. And the impacts have been highest in the regions that are most vulnerable, low income, and have relatively high share of high exposure sectors. Here we go. Remember when I said climate change impacts on the labor force and in general are heterogeneous? The highest impacts or highest net attributable negative impacts are in Western Africa, Southeastern Asia, and Middle Africa. On the other hand, historical climate change actually has resulted in a benefit, a net benefit in Northern European regions. Again, regions that are high income seem to have benefited from historical warming. Some mechanisms, it's not as important as small gains in Northern America, Eastern Asia, and Eastern Europe, but huge losses already in regions that we consider highly vulnerable to climate change and low income. Importantly, we already can attribute this labor force outcome negative impacts to GDP losses. What we find is that in 2018 alone, in Southeastern Asia, nearly 1/5 of GDP losses could be attributed to climate change negative impacts on the labor force. In low exposure sectors, even low exposure sectors are not immune. Even in Western Africa, 8% loss in GDP due to climate change impacts on the labor force. So what we've been trying to show is how climate change affects directly the labor force, especially in high exposure sectors, but also in low exposure sectors such as manufacturing, and how that translates to what policymakers seem to care about, losses in GDP. And what we show and what we find is substantial losses in GDP and substantial losses in income due to climate change impacts on the labor force. The future looks bleak. I mean, it looks bright because it's going to be very hot, but bleak because 1/5 of the workforce in several regions will not be able to go to work at the rate of warming we're achieving, right? And of course, achievement is not always good, especially when you are achieving such high rates of warming. Remember COVID? That was a preview. What happens when half of your workforce cannot go to work, right? You need substantial safety nets. The world doesn't do really well when it comes to proactive safety nets, right? Especially economics, because we are a reactionary science. And if public health is not careful, they are at the risk of being exactly like that, lurching from crisis to crisis and trying to react instead of being proactive. Again, you can see future warming will put regions such as Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Southeastern Asia at the highest risks. What does it mean, right? Again, science to policy translation. Attribution is critical for the debate on loss and damage. It is critical to provide evidence in the field of climate litigation. The next battles in economics or any serious science is not going to be fought out in the top 5 journals. It will be in the court of law. We will have to take our evidence to lawyers who do not believe in the science, who do not believe in climate change. We have to defend our work against them. That's where the next challenge is. A bit of concern about just transition. I've just come back from Baku where I organized a session at the ILO Pavilion. There are growing concerns over potential mishandling of just transition policies and strategies from governments, labor unions, in general, due to the lack of protection for workers. And this is something we'll also have to put serious attention to. We've already seen how heterogeneous and how damaging heat stress is for the labor force. With respect to long-term development options, both mitigation and adaptation will have to be undertaken side by side. It's no longer enough to put them in silos or work in silos, especially due to political changes in political landscape. And of course, these intra-regional differences in labor force impacts is already leading to poverty traps. This will require proactive policies. This will require proactive safety nets from governments, whether it be regional, national, European level for that matter, if we want to achieve a healthy labor force, if we want to ensure safe and working conditions for the labor force in the context of a changing climate. With that, thank you for your attention. I'm done.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've been treated to 4 superb presentations. I'm now going to invite you to ask some questions, challenge our panelists, raise queries if you want any clarification. While you're considering your questions, I'm just going to throw one question to the panel. In all of the work that you have been doing in the area of climate change and trying to impact on climate change, can you share with us what you have come across as the single biggest obstacle in trying to reach out to change policy? What is the obstacle holding it back? Is there a political consideration, an economic, they just don't believe the science? So what's driving those challenges that each of you are grappling with as we think about how we're going to have an even bigger impact on policy going forward? So I start with you, Montia.
Thank you. Great question, and thank you, fellow presenters. Wonderful to learn from you all. I think one of the challenges, certainly for Save the Children, is not having the right people around the table. So, as you would expect, children and inclusivity of children's interests, their needs, their willingness to be at the table is often overlooked. And if we don't do multi-sectoral governance inclusive of child participation and community participation, then we lose those voices. We lose how the narrative of how climate change really impacts our day-to-day lives. And this is a problem that we are passing on to the next generation. So unfortunately for our children and their children's children, we are passing this on, and it's their burden to bear. So the more that we can do now to improve those processes of sharing science, how it can be used effectively through a governance system that can be very complicated, the better. But it means inclusivity, and we need to build that into an information sharing process that is in a governance process where we have to make those decisions now. There is urgency.
And I mean, a key issue, who's sitting at the table, because that's where you've got to have that impact. Great point. Thank you very much. Claudia, go ahead. If you just speak into it, there's nothing to press.
Thank you. So I think one of the big challenges that we face as in the Kirkus Trust is the underfunding of research and seed systems in the countries we operate, because we are only able to do a very, very specific intervention, and maybe there are improved varieties being released, but then we don't really have much control on how these varieties then get to the farmers. And the farming communities are the majority of the population in some countries, but they don't have very often political voice. So I think this is the main problem.
So it's those who are going to deal with the bulk of the impact are those who are most vulnerable, but those are also the most voiceless, the most marginalized, and figuring out how to get their voices heard is one of the challenges we need to be grappling with. Good point. Thanks very much, Claudia. Anthony.
In all the years I've been working on this issue in the Caribbean, I have never once had a politician say, I don't believe the science. So that is really not the problem. However, over that period, almost all the new development, new housing development, new hotels and so forth, have gone into areas that we believe are going to go underwater in years ahead. So there's a complete disconnect between what the politicians are saying and the way that they actually behave. The reason for this, I'm afraid, is not very nice. Firstly, if it's happening after the next election, this is really not an issue. They're not concerned. Second, we have an enormous problem with corruption, and developers pay good money to get the permits needed to put these developments up in areas that we believe are going to be in harm's way, even though this means that the burden of the problem is going to be bigger than it need be otherwise. And thirdly, this is also not a very noble motive. When we talk to our politicians about this, the reaction is not, oh dear, what can we do to mitigate this? It's, how can we get compensation for this? And they're looking for very large sums of money in payment from somebody to compensate for the burden that will fall to the small islands of the world. But interestingly, they don't look to China, because although China emits more carbon than the United States and Europe combined, and they don't look to India, they look to the traditional aid donors of Europe and and the United States. Mainly because they see this as a sort of an extension of existing aid programs. So, I'm afraid, I'm not optimistic. And until we get perhaps a new generation of people coming into politics who are a little bit more seized of the issues, as opposed to being seized of the money, then this is not going to change. But this won't happen anytime soon, because we have in the Caribbean some of the oldest politicians in the world. Once they're elected, they never, ever go away. So this is going to take a little time. I'm sorry to give you such a bleak and pessimistic assessment.
So you're seeing, I mean, the challenge is a pecuniary one, that it's become monetized, and the driving forces behind it about who can gain from the financial spoils rather than, what's in it for humanity. Sure.
Thank you.
Help us here. I don't want to be as dejected as that.
Fair enough. Everyone's alluded to political will or the lack of it, right? That remains the biggest challenge, and that's evident from Baku. Politicians are playing around the Caspian Sea instead of doing what they're supposed to do. But moving to science and policy translation, the biggest barrier remains to me the lack of understanding of barriers to uptake. You can have the best evidence, you can have the best policy or the most effective policy on book, but we also need to improve our understanding of why someone somewhere might not be able to implement that policy, right? An example would be if we go to rural Bangladesh and tell households that, well, from tomorrow you can no longer use wood for cooking, right? She's going to say, well, great, what's the alternative, right? So you can have the best policy on book. It's going to reduce indoor air pollution, improve their health, but what we don't do well enough is understand why they may not follow on that policy. Thanks.
Yeah, so having policies that can't be implemented and they go against people's survival instincts is going to be a challenge. So, ladies and gentlemen, your thoughts. Go ahead. We need a microphone here. Okay, I'll come to you now. Go ahead.
Really, thank you very much.
Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Ratemu Michieka, the chairperson, president of the Kenya National Academy of Sciences in Nairobi, Kenya. Really excellent presentations. Thank you very much. Just an addition to what our colleague from Caribbean said on cigarette smoking. We had a study sponsored by AIP in Eastern Africa on cigarette smoking. The academies did an excellent job, really, in making sure that any information against smoking that hurt the population was documented. And the 4 countries that sat on that met. But then when I went to Nairobi, I was part of the team. We sat in a hotel. We invited. I'm just supporting the parliamentarians and other public. Once they see a very nice researched paper, they would follow it. We sat in a hotel like this, about 100 people, parliamentarians, lawyers, doctors, then the academy, bring them together. Went through the whole works on the impact of cigarette smoking in humans. Within a week, Kenya passed a law banning cigarettes in public and designated areas only were allowed for them to smoke. That was July 1, 2008, just after the UK had passed it. So really, a good material and the way presented would always sell. And I'm glad that you just brought it up. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for that example from Kenya. Yes, go ahead. At this end, microphone here, please.
Oh, yeah. I shall bring it to you. Absolutely. No problems at all. Absolutely.
Oh, such a gentleman.
I too have to stand. I cannot tell you what brilliant presentation, Sunny. What a panel. Montira, the work you're doing with children is absolutely phenomenal. Congratulations to you, Save the Children, and IAP. And I mean, the rest of you are doing amazing things, but I really have to point to Shura. Shura, you've just come back from Baku. Did anybody mention the UN Secretary General's call for action for extreme heat that came out on the 25th of July this summer? It's the first time I've really seen the Secretary General respond to a global crisis of heat. And one of the things we really struggled to do was to bring in so much of the labour work which you have now summarised in this excellent paper in Nature. Thank you. I do commend you all to look at it. It's phenomenal. He just merely pointed towards it. So well done and great piece of work. But one of the things that came through from all that work that we did was that we were asked through the Global Heat Health Information Network, which links to the World Meteorological Organization and the World Health Organization, to identify how many days children had lost at school because of heat waves. And we really struggled to do that. Can we think about showing the harm to children by having that sort of information ready? It would be phenomenal.
Wait, you didn't introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry, I'm Virginia Murray. I work for the UK Health Security Agency, and I'm very closely involved with the International Science Council and the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. I am the chair of the Global Hazard List, which we are reviewing for 2025 for the UN Global Platform on Disaster Risk Reduction.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Murray. Yes, go ahead, just behind.
Sibel Eker from International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria, Radboud University in the Netherlands, and Global Young Academy. Thank you very much to all speakers. This was really wonderful. So I have one question. When we talk about climate impacts on health or on economy, I think we are certain that there will be very adverse, very bad impacts, but there is still quite a wide range of uncertainty. So we don't know if it will be 10%, 50%, or 80%. So my question is especially to speakers who work in action-oriented organizations. So what is the impact of this uncertainty in your work, in your decisions, and how do you deal with that?
Mm-hmm. Good question.
Can I jump in, because I'm an economist? I think I know. I claim I know everything better than everyone, but that's not true. The action research is obviously where this is going to be. But my suggestion, as someone who deals with computing uncertainty, is don't put all your eggs in the uncertainty basket. Under catastrophic climate change, it's not going to matter how big the uncertainty range is. We are not going to exist if we go there. Yeah? Let's not talk about uncertainty when it comes to action research. But that's a very good point. So.
I agree with that. That's what we consider all the time in the science and modeling work.
Give her the microphone. Just repeat your point on the microphone. It's being recorded, so we need to hear it.
Okay, thank you very much for the quick response. I think that's wonderful. In the science and modeling world, we always talk about this uncertainty ranges and look at the worst cases, but I'm really curious how it affects the daily decisions.
I'm going to invite the panel to comment in a minute, but I feel that this audience questioning is somewhat lopsided because they seem to be all on this side. So, in fairness to the other side of the aisle, I'm going to give one person a chance to ask a question on that side. So please, somebody rise up to the occasion, stand for your side. Yeah, you have to cross the other side. Now go ahead. The mic's coming to you. Hold on, just give it a sec.
Thank you. Tibor Molnár, PhD student from University of Szeged, Hungary. First of all, thank you very much for these excellent and insightful presentations. I don't know whom should be thankful more, for the organizers to invite such excellent speakers, or for the speakers themselves for their presentations. I would like to emphasize 2 points, tobacco and smoking. Much earlier, the Hungarian Formula One Grand Prix was named after a brand name of a cigarette manufacturer. And after smoking was gradually banned, that was a ministerial permit year after year to use that brand name exclusively on that event. At that time, smoking was prohibited in restaurants, in public places, now already in train stations, bus stops, whatever. What now can see, you cannot even see the brand name of the package on the box of cigarette. No brand name, but pictures of cancered lungs and so on. So any ugly thing that would deteriorate potential smokers from smoking. On the other side of the coin, planting and growing tobacco plants was a good business for some families. It was part of business. The whole system was developed. Of course, it's a wicked problem. So if you ban smoking, fewer and fewer amount of tobacco is needed. Therefore, those families who are adjusted to growing tobacco plants cannot suffer from the financial difficulties. One point. Other point, climate change and changing the sort of plants grown. In Hungary, more than 1 million hectares of corn was grown. I should say used to, because of the severe drought during the summer month, halved the crop of corn. So farmers should shift either to irrigating corn or to shift to other crop like sorghum or anything else. Another plant 10 years earlier.
Sorry, can I ask you to wrap up?
Okay. 10 years earlier, Hungary produced as much potatoes as it needed. Now more than half is imported, and because of climate change, potato doesn't like temperature before above 25 degrees, and now batata, sweet potato, planting trials are ongoing to find a crop that can be grown in such a high temperature drought climate. So congratulations for your job, and climate change requires such activities. Thank you very much.
Thanks for just highlighting the challenges we're going to see and the way in which we can grow crops or not. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have to just acknowledge that the left wing here is clearly in ascendancy. I'm going to give the right wing a last opportunity to rise up. Otherwise, it's going to be left wing wins. Okay, go ahead.
Maybe one of the ladies, Pangrizio Canales, can... So the question of the increasing climate anxiety effects on children or younger generations, do any of your organizations make research about that, for instance. You know that people, younger generations, are not actually willing to have children anymore, or not in that much numbers. Do you deal with that question?
Wonderful. Now I'm going to ask each of the panelists to comment or respond to any of the points made or add anything they'd like to. And I'm going to ask them to do so in 30 seconds. So just a quick comment. Let's start with Montira. Go ahead.
Thank you. So yes, about climate anxiety, that is real. I've seen a lot of anecdotal evidence, but I haven't seen a meta-analysis on that. We have done landscape analyses on how children perceive climate change as a threat, what they want to do about it, and you're seeing more and more with these big high-profile meetings like the COPs, children being invited to attend and having a space at the table, and their voices being very clear. And they're very angry, they want action, and they don't want more and more talking. Going to go to the question about attribution, and that is a challenge, as Shuro mentioned, because it makes it hard for us to design interventions to target, to produce the desired impacts that we want for health and well-being. Even though there is uncertainty, there is new attribution science that you may know about, and that's become very, very popular and very exciting because we can now, based on certain events, very quickly attribute the probability that climate change has to contributing to a flood event, to an extreme heat event. And that's very helpful. But when day to day on the ground, when we work with our country offices and our communities on the ground, I don't need to make the case anymore about climate change and health. They know it's a problem. They ask us, what can we do? How do we work better together with our country governments to enact and implement the plans they already have in place? So what we try to do is to bring technical advice. We try to bring case study examples and best practice of what can work. But we also have to recognize that there is a range of context-specific factors that affect adverse health outcomes. So we have to go upstream, climate change, exposure to climate hazards, but also address those underlying inequities to address those adverse health impacts.
Thanks, Montira. Claudia, a quick comment?
Maybe I'll say also that in agriculture and in food production, it's getting increasingly difficult to engage young generations because it's a very difficult job. You may lose everything. And in many countries, you don't have the safety support networks that you would have here. So that is your yearly income that has just been affected by a drought or by flooding. And there are some initiatives to try to counteract this, but they're not enough and not functional. Thank you.
Thanks. Anthony.
May I come back to this very important point about dealing with uncertainties, and also the point that Shuro raised. At a basic level, we can, I think, start to deal with uncertainties by identifying no regrets strategies. So if we do X rather than Y, it won't actually cost us any more, and we will also mitigate certain kinds of risk. Now, that actually won't get us very far. If we really want to get some traction with political decision makers, and this is something that most academics are not good at, we have to give them win-win options. So it has to sound like a win-win option. So instead of, for example, saying, well, we've got to stop doing this and we've got to stop doing that, and they'll say, I'm sorry, I can't do anything with that. I cannot sell that to my colleagues. But what you can do is go along and say, look, we can do this and that better. So, for example, we talk about the investment opportunities in renewable energy technologies. For years, we hit up against this idea that you couldn't really change the way the building industry worked. So what we did was we actually built a net zero energy building, which is climate resilient, built it just outside my office on the Mona campus. And the university is now incredibly proud of this, having given me absolutely no support, and is now boasting about it. And it's actually having quite an impact because we can demonstrate that this building costs you nothing to run. And not only does it cost you nothing to run, it's actually charging up the vehicle outside. So they get free motoring as well. And all of a sudden, people are saying, oh no, okay, this works. I could see us doing this. So we have to stop talking about oh, we've got to stop putting housing in the flood-prone areas, and say, well, look, if we just start building housing like this, we could save a truckload of money, we could cut into our biggest import bill, and we could be generating employment and profits. Now you're talking the kind of language that politicians love to hear. So if we just emphasize what we could be doing on the upside, we'll get a lot further, we'll get a lot more traction.
Thank you. Sure, quick last word.
Yeah, just point on children education, climate change. So we do have some research ongoing. What we find is contrasting research. After heat waves, or just before, if the farmers think there's a heat wave coming, they pull their children out of schools and put them to work. However, after droughts, especially long-term droughts, enrollment actually increases simply because there is no crops to work on. So this is something we're trying to reconcile, but brilliant point. Thank you. I'll get back to you on this. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it just remains for me to say you've been a terrific audience. We've had a terrific set of speakers. And I think what we've heard is that as scientists, our task is to generate the evidence so that the truth stares you in the face and becomes incontrovertible. But it's our task to ensure we convey the nature of that evidence, to convince people. But today we see less and less of that kind of skepticism about climate change, but more about skepticism about what it's going to take to undo it, and skepticism about the course of action to be followed. And what we've seen is the importance of examples of success, that success breeds success. And people who see success want to emulate success. And so we need to keep up with those case studies. We need to show the world that we can create the elements to fight climate change. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our wonderful 4 speakers. And to all of you, have a lovely day.